Hello everyone, welcome to the course on Health Humanities, Indian and Western Medical Knowledge Traditions. This is Module 2, Critical History of Medicine. In this module, I am dealing the first lecture, which is of entire course, the sixth lecture, The Politics of Health and Medicine. The question like when we think about health, when we think about medicine, we usually go by some kind of facts which are available to us, and we usually forget the social and cultural contexts. We never think usually about the politics, the idea of politics in medicine, the idea of politics of medicine and of health usually remains sidelined. But it plays a very crucial role when we think about overall health and well-being, because the person exists in the society, and the social determinants, cultural determinants affect the way one is getting medical and health facilities. In this course, I will be discussing about how politics of health has become so crucial, and in this regard I will be further going into the birth of clinic, the birth of hospitals, and then I'll move on the issue of public health. Then I'll be back to the Indian context, where I'll talk about colonial medical practice, health, medical practice and race, and then I'll talk about colonial medical acts and their usage in contemporary times, and finally I'll end this talk. So the question comes about why this is called critical history of medicine, or what is critical about medicine. The question like why it is called critical history of medicine, and when we think about why it is critical, then one has to think about that the idea of critical history of medicine expands the scope of medical beyond the clinical encounters, beyond hospitals, and includes several contexts. It can be social, it can be political, it can be economic, it can be cultural, it can be religious, and how these contexts affect one's encounter with medicine. Further, the term, the word critical largens one's awareness about the context of health and how the idea of health is formulated at various levels. And it also includes that one has to think critically, one has to think in a skeptic way, one has to evaluate the notion of health, not at the level of surface, but at various social, cultural, political, historical, religious, and other lines. Moreover, the concept of critical mobilizes the long philosophical and political tradition of critique to emphasize what it is doing and what medicine is capable of doing, and how the person who receives health, what kind of roles they play, and the person who are treating, how they respond to these medical needs. In this regard, one has to think about various aspects of health and illness. Let us take one example. Recently in the COVID period, when we think about the people like who have been affected with coronavirus, but at the same time, despite their disease of coronavirus, they were also facing some kind of religious or racial stigmatization. For example, when we think about the origin of coronavirus, it is often referred as sometime Chinese virus. It is also referred as something which is associated with a particular creed, particular religious beliefs. So in a way, the idea of illness gets associated with some kind of religious, racial, or some other forms of identity, and then it also indulges in some kind of stigmatization of the illness and and the consequent medical treatments. Moreover, when we think about the treatments which have been provided, there are also some kind of disparity between the countries which are rich and the countries which are poor, the people who can afford and the people who cannot afford. And then we further find the qualities of medicines which have been distributed across globe, and the qualities of medicine may differ depending upon the economy of the country. Hence, we have to think about the critical aspect of health and illness and their spread, their access to the people. And moving further, when we think about how medicine, how hospitals, and how clinics came into existence, then one has to go back around 700 and 800 years back and think about the Middle Ages. Around by the end of 11th century, there were some kind of changes happening in the European world, and by the time of Middle Ages, there was disappearance of the people who were affected with leprosy. And this disappearance of leprosy was not something very easy. As per the rules of that time, as per the legal system of that time, the people who were having leprosy, they were thrown out of the city. They were thrown out of the city doors, and hence the place has become free from the people who are having leprosy. And then arose another way of handling the people who are having leprosy, or some other kind of social problems which are also health problems. And then they began to, in France, they began to construct leisure houses. And by 1226, there were 43 such houses were built, and which were having around 2,000 inmates. And but these leisure houses also got emptied by 15th century. When we think about the number of leisure houses in England and Scotland, the number was around 220. In Germany, the number was approximately same. But what happened by the end of 15th century, everywhere in England, Scotland, France, Germany, these leisure houses became emptied, and then the government converted these houses in hospitals, or they became part of hospitals. And some rooms in the hospitals were reserved for the people who are having leprosy. But once they were converted to hospitals, they became some kind of detention centers. So hospitals were not the way we see hospitals today. Hospitals were a place which are meant for confinement, which are meant for detention centers, where people who are having some kind of mental illness, some kind of insanity, or any kind of mental disturbance, they were imprisoned. So the hospitals in 15th century were almost, if not exactly similar to modern hospitals, where they were functioning the roles of curing the people. On one side, that is the form of modern hospitals, but on the other side, they were also functioning the role of jails and prisons, which are the form of detention centers. And when we think about the time from 1693 to 1695, and by that time all the leisure houses were transformed into confinements, and they were also partially working as the chain of hospitals. What we find over here, that these hospitals or these leisure houses, they were not meant solely for treating or curing the people. but they were limiting the privacy, they were limiting the liberty of the people who are having illness. Hence, what we notice over here, that medicine and the medical system, they were not just treating the people, but they were also colliding with the legal system and confining, detaining the people who are having certain kind of psychological or maybe some kind of physical illness and disease. And when we come to India and think about the role of Western medicine, it has a very complex and debatable history. When we think about the role of British government in public health in India, and then we find that the critics and supporters have their own logic, their own arguments. The question comes that, does public health flourish under British agency, under British government? Some may agree, but some may not agree. The reason is that the concept of health, the concept of Western medicine, which flourished during colonial period in India, that has certain kind of norms, certain kind of regulations, which were not meant for helping people as it is meant in some other countries, or as it is meant for white people. So there were one norm for Indian people and other norms for British people, and where Indians were seen as someone inferior, someone secondary citizens, and Britishers who were seen as superior, they had different rules. The people who were arguing against Western medical practice in India, and they assert that the Western medical practice in India was in a way some kind of medium to protect the health of colonial enclaves. And further, there is a debate that whether someone think about the entire medical practice in colonial British India as public health or state medicine, and it's safer to call it state medicine, not public health, because it was not available to the masses, not available to the common public. And at the same time, the Western medicine, the British medicine in the colonial period, was a medium of colonial power. It was a medium of controlling the Indian people. It was a means of control. Of course, at the same time, it was also seen as, to some extent, a mode of reformation. But more than that, it was part and parcel of British imperialism. And when we move and when we think about what does Western medicine has to say about this, and how has this Western medicine been represented in the Indian context, and or how does the Western medicine has seen the medical practices in India, the question comes that most of the Western medicine practitioners consider that the medical system in India is far more inferior, far more isolated, and it is the burden of white people, burden of the British system to provide public health, so-called public health, to the Indian people. And in this way, we have the commencement of Western medical system in India, particularly in Calcutta in 19th century. And in the name of public health, the reforms, the tasks which they have taken, they were in terms of sanitary reform, urban planning, and creations of hospitals and dispensaries. But the question also comes that how Western medicine came into India, how they spread. And there are a lot of logics how they spread, but some of the common logics are that it's spread through trade, like how Britishers were making a deal for trade with Indian people, and then for the safety of their own people, they began to see that the Indian people whom the Britishers are coming into contact, they are safer. It spread through laborers, through migration, political expansions, that England began to rule over India, and when they began to expand their empires, similarly Western medicine expanded. It expanded through religious expansion in terms of convergence, and when the process of conversion was happening, they began to say that here you can get some kind of free medical treatments, which can cure all your physical and mental ailments, and so it was also a form of religious expansion. It was not purely treating the illness, the disease of a person, but medicine was meant for convergence sometimes. It was also a form of cultural diffusion in early 20th century. And when we think about Western medicine, it has other names such as European medicine, or we sometimes refer it as Angrezi Dawa. And the reason like why Western medicine has so many cultural, political and social issues, because it was a means of colonial control, it was a means of power and domination. It was seen as a new form of medicine in India over other medicines, maybe Ayurvedic, maybe some other kinds of medicine. But more than treating the people who are having disease, who are having illness, this was seen as a cultural project which has to assert the superiority of West, the superiority of colonial British government over India. That India is an inferior country, and through their Western model of medicine, they are trying to civilize, they are trying to actually provide better health facilities to Indian people. So in a way, Western medicine was used as a medium to hide the colonial barbaric practices, and it was also to assert that how Western people are superior over the Indian people. Moreover, the introduction of Western medicine in India was seen as scientific, as something which are rational over unscientific, superstitious, indigenous medicine of India, indigenous medical practices in India. So they began to subordinate, segregate and isolate the Indian medical practices, and reveal their own cultural, social and scientific superiority. When we think further about colonial medical system, Pramod K. Nair in his book Colonial Vices, The Discourse of Empire writes that the account of disease in colonial India initiates one of the powerful makers of difference in the 19th century. Why? Because in the colonial period, body became a space where colonial policies and theories of disease and cure could be enacted in the form of quarantine, in the form of test, in some other different forms, which means when a medical test and medical practices were getting evolved, they were testing their medicines over Indian people. So Indian people were the space where they were testing, where they were evaluating their own medical practices, or maybe they were testing the power of their medicines. And so that if something goes wrong, the people who are affected, they are not British citizens, they are Indian citizens. So what we find over here, that the medicines which are not tested, they began to be tested on Indian people, or maybe colonial period in general. It can be South African, it can be some other colonized people. And in this way, we witness that medicine has a large number of power kind of power and domination equation, that if it has to be tested, it has to be tested to the people who are not the British citizens, not the American citizens. But when the medicine comes in their final phase, and most of the records of medical practices which you find, they are usually about then the Western white people, and the medical formulas are then built as per the requirement of Western white people. Even Western white women have been ignored then, and maybe in some of the cases at present time as well. So what we witness over here, that medical practices have some kind of racial as well as gender segregation. And as I said earlier, that medicine was not simply a medium of treating and curing the people. It was a form of colonization. The British government didn't control India only by force. They controlled India by using their knowledge, number one. Number two, by using their force. Number three, by using some other means. And one of those means was medical discourse. How medical discourse was a tool of domination and control, or how it became a site of interaction and resistance. Here we have to think about that the people who were medical practitioners in India and who were British people, who were British soldiers, who were British doctors, they were not simply treating the people, but they were also functioning as a kind of interlocutor between the Indian and the British government. They were working as some kind of cultural translator. They were also working as someone who can mediate between Indian people and the British rulers. So the European doctors, the British doctors who were in India during colonial period, they were not just doing the task of treating people, but they were working as someone who can mediate between India and the British people, British soldiers, British government. And then they began to also pass the information about Indians, or maybe Indian cultures, about Indian flora, fauna, Indian goods, and some other kind of things which Britishers can take with them. So they were passing the information about different aspects of Indian systems to the white rulers. And hence the European doctors had multiple tasks apart from just being concerned about medical practice. And in this way we find that the colonial medical practice was working as a kind of biopolitical situation, where the body has become a machine and which has to be regulated in terms of health, but for the sake of labor force, for the sake of upkeep, for the sake of helping the British soldiers. Moreover, the Indian people who were getting treatments, they were not given these treatments to cure the Indian people, but they were given these treatments so that they are keeping the British soldiers, the British people, healthy if they come in contact with them. The purpose was not to help to cure the Indian people, but to make the British soldiers and the British people safer. And let us think about one case about how Western medical practice in India was working. This case is going back to 1883, when Lord Dufferin has introduced, wife of Lord Dufferin, Lady Dufferin has introduced the medical care for Bengali women in West Bengal. or let's say for women in Kolkata. And what we find over here, that when healthcare was introduced for Indian women, then we find a twist over here, that in all the Indian women in general were not having access to the medical practices. Only those women who were seen as someone who can live with British soldiers, who can entertain British soldiers, they were given or they were having access to Western medical system, Western medical practices. The reason was that if the British army personnel comes in contact with Indian women, then they are safe, particularly in terms of sexual diseases. And in this regard, in 1868, a medical act was passed, which was meant to take special care of the people who are coming, particularly the women who are coming in contact with the British soldiers. And so what we find over here, that entire colonial practice of medicine in India has so many other purposes. It has cultural, it has social, it has political, it has intellectual, in terms of superiority of knowledge, and so many other purposes and consequences. Let us think about how health and medical practice can also be racial, as I said in the case of coronavirus. And when we think about how white people or how colonial doctors looked at the natives, how they looked at the native patients, the native doctors, and their usual reactions are that they are ignorant, they are dirty, they are superstitious. Why? Because that sometimes doctors may say that think about the God, think about, have a faith in God. People go and worship. And so they say that they are superstitious, ignorant, and they are not having any kind of scientific basis for their medical practices. More in this way, they try to actually assert their cultural and racial superiority. So the West has been seen as someone who are superior and who are rational in terms of medical practices, and the East, or let us say the Orient, the Indian and other colonized countries, they are seen as inferior, irrational, and who are in need of Western medical practices to get cured, to get healed. And any kind of medical practices, whether it's Indian, Asian, African healing specialists, any practices which they do, they are seen to be something which are of inferior nature. Hence they are denounced. They are seen as something brutal, barbaric, unscientific. And in contrast, Western medical practice was presumed to be something which are enlightened and which are having rational basis. In this way, Western medicine was not just to help the people, but they had the fundamental task of formulating European identity. They had the fundamental task of projecting the Western world, the British Empire, as something superior. And in contrast, consider and represent Indian and Indian medical practices as marginal, as something inferior, something secondary, and which are in need of Western system. Let us come to some of the acts which have been used in colonial period and maybe in contemporary period, and what was their purpose. One was Contagious Disease Act, which I referred earlier. That was passed to keep the British soldiers safe if they come in sexual contact with any Indian woman. In this regard, the the women like who are coming in contact with British soldiers, they were having health checkups, not for the sake of their own safety, but for the sake of the safety of British soldiers. Further, think about the Epidemic Disease Act, which was which came into existence in 1897. These two acts, they were one, that they were trying to protect their own officers, their own soldiers. At the same time, they were providing extra power to the British government, that they can detain, they can prohibit, they can stop, they can oppress the Indian people in the name of these two acts. And the act was first began in Calcutta, and but after many years, in 2020 COVID-19, we witnessed that the same act was revoked by the government of West Bengal, and anyone like who are violating, then they were punished as per this law. And when we think about Contagious Disease Act, it was also adopted by most of the states in India during COVID-19. And during this period, more than thousands of people were detained, not detained, but they were like seen as someone who were offenders of the rules. So the Contagious Disease Act or Epidemic Disease Act, which were meant in a very particular power domination mode, they still function, maybe sometime used in contemporary times to accumulate more power. Think about Disaster Management Act. As per newspaper reports, that when this act was used in coronavirus time, then around 3 lakh people were registered for violating the law. So what we find over here, that the medical acts are used selectively, they are used to oppress the people, they are used to not just for helping the people, but to control, to subordinate, to dominate the people. So medical acts have different purposes. One can think about every country has their own medical acts, and then they oppress their own citizens in different ways. When we think about maybe the context of gender, maybe I'll talk about this in another lecture, where we'll talk about like how legal system and gender are intertwined, and then they prohibit healthcare access to women. So to end, what we have discussed over here, that Western medicine have been seen as something superior, and they were very crucial in the formation of Western societies. They project themselves as, Western medicine helps the British government, the Western people, to project themselves that they are having some kind of benevolence over the native people, and they are more civilized. Which may be and may not be depending upon different cases, as we have discussed earlier. Moreover, the medical practices were trying to legitimate the colonial process, the colonial operations, and they were facilitating imperial dominance. And in this way, they began to project that Western medicine, Western culture, Western people are superior, and they have superior access to health, body, disease. And further, we find that medical practice is not solely for the sake of curing, but they have some kind of racial and negative representations of non-Western peoples. In this way, when we make a critical study of Western medicine, we find that the practice of Western medicine has so many other nuances which one has to think over. And with this, I would end over here. Thank you very much.